This next video will look at the individual needs principle, which is very, very important because not only do we need to understand the sporting demands, but we also need to understand what an individual's specific needs are. So what we're going to look at in this small section is understanding what we mean by individual needs, how we can go about considering key factors, and how we can put together a program that ultimately meets the needs of an individual. And just referring back to what we looked at in the capability versus demand principle, ultimately here we're looking at not just broad principles, but a highly specific one. So what does an athlete need on an individual basis that's going to provide them with the physical tools to meet the needs of the sport, hopefully go beyond those demands so they can excel on the pitch without getting injured and perform at their best. So what is individualisation to begin with? Ultimately, and very simply, we mean aligning a training program with the needs of the individual. And the needs, as we're going to be speaking about in a second, are pretty broad ranging from injury profile to training age to previous injury, and position requirements and various other things. Ultimately, what's important when you're writing a program is that the loading, the parameters, the principles you're using are aligned with what the individual needs. Now, when you're working in large groups, this can become logistically difficult because if you're working with a squad of 20 to 25 players, potentially you haven't got the resource to write an individualized program over time, highly specifically. But in the planning and periodization module, I'm going to be talking through a system that I use at Hockey Wales, which is basically building systems that enable you to individualize from a centralized model. So we're going to be addressing that problem later on in this course. But to begin with, I just wanted to talk through what actually individualization really means, the factors we have to consider, and what we need to do when programming for an individual. Again, referring back to this classical book from Zatsiorsky and Kraemer, individualization of training will optimize results, enhance the desired adaptation to the training protocol. If we have an intended outcome and an adaptation that we are looking to achieve within the body, either that's yourself if you're training or whether you're a coach and you're writing the program for someone, the more we individualize for someone, the more we optimize the results and enhance desired adaptations. If we can enhance desired adaptations, we can have more of a performance impact. And that's a very key factor here. So ensuring that what we're doing is enhancing results ultimately for the athlete is super, super important. So why is it important? It's important for a few reasons here. First of all, it provides an appropriate training stimulus. Going back to the capability demand equation, if we are placing too much load on an athlete, then we're going to be potentially causing injury. If we're not placing enough stimulus on the athlete, then they're going to detrain. So it's important that we have an understanding of where an athlete is, what they need, and what's appropriate for them. It avoids the risk of injury for those factors, as well as ensuring that when we're writing a program, we are doing all the right things so that the exercises we pick, the loading we pick, is helping an athlete to prevent the risk of injury based on their assessment profile. And again, in the next section, we're going to be looking at assessment and how we can develop lots of useful information that's going to enable us to write a highly individualized program off the back of that. It prevents overtraining and detraining for the similar reasons we've just explained. It's motivational because for an athlete, if they see that what they're doing is aligned with what they're currently capable of doing, where their opportunities for development are, and it's aligned with what they want to achieve as well, then we know from things like self-determination theory that it's going to be more motivating for someone if they've got a little bit of a sense of autonomy in the direction they're going, and ultimately that it is aligned with the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And then finally, it's easier to achieve goals. If you're going off on a path that isn't really aligned with the ultimate goal, it's going to become pretty hard to achieve it. But we're making sure everything is aligned and streamlined so that it's all pointing in the same direction and that the athlete is clear on the goals and knows why they're doing the training program, they're going to be motivated, bought in, and likely to continue training, and that's ultimately going to lead to success in the long run. As a sort of overview of what we've just been talking about here, two athletes can respond differently to the same program, and that is for multiple factors. Two coaches may deliver different results with the same athlete. Two exercises can deliver the same outcome, So it always comes down to context and principles. There are many ways you can achieve similar outcomes. There are also, from the same program, many outcomes that can be achieved. And this is because of the complex interaction between the coach, the athlete, and the ability of an athlete to adapt to the training program, as well as how the coach is choosing to deliver the program. So if you take two coaches and you give them the same program, it's actually kind of unlikely they'd both achieve the same result with the same athlete, because they're going to approach it a little differently. So what's important here, just to draw it back to those principles, is that we have to understand the context of the individual, we have to understand training principles, we have to ensure that the outcome we're trying to achieve is aligned to adaptation principles and what the program ultimately looks like. So there are many ways in which we can individualize training. So we've got the methods that we pick, the equipment we use, the frequency of training, the rest periods, the exercises, how we approach coaching, the density of work, the tempo of the lifts, how we go about loading an athlete, the volumes, the times of day we want to train, and all of those comes down to kind of personal preferences of the athlete. So even just in that short overview, we can see that in order to individualize, there are many, many factors we have to consider and many ways in which we can do it. So if we're not intentional in how we go about individualizing it, it's very easy to kind of miss some important details. Factors to consider overall, firstly, age, and we can break age into biological, chronological, and training ages. Biological, we just mean when we're looking at things like peak height velocity in youth athletes, is their relative age based on their maturity status. And it's a little bit beyond the scope of this course to go into that in any huge amount of detail. But in essence, athletes of the same chronological age, i.e. two 13-year-old boys, can have a different biological age. And we see this at that sort of age because some athletes grow very quickly at that kind of age, some develop a little bit later, and eventually obviously it kind of plateaus out in later kind of teens. But that's an important consideration because some athletes can be growing fast, some athletes can be going through peak height velocity at that current moment, and things like that lead to reductions in coordination, potential injury risks, and various other factors. So that's one key one. Their chronological age is also a key sort of consideration because have they got key exams around that time? Is the age they're at, are they able to, emotionally to deal with going through a structured training program? If not, it's probably not appropriate to coach them. If they are, probably appropriate. And then training age, which is how long athlete has trained for with a structured sort of training program. So if an athlete's got a training age of 0, either have no training history, then it's important that what you do is appropriate for them versus an athlete who's got a 10-year training age, in which case they can do more advanced training, tolerate more loads, and various other factors. Time, how much time is available, that's also key. Their personality type, are they introverted or extroverted? Do they like detail? Are they not really too interested in detail? All of those factors are key in terms of how you go about delivering the training program if you are a coach. Overall stress, stress as a whole is dealt with the same physiologically, and the body will produce similar responses to stress, whether it's coming from training, exam pressure, financial pressure, relationships with other people. All of those things are going to be causing different types of stresses. So if stress is high from one factor, it's not a good idea to push harder with training because it's just another stressor on the system. So a key one here would be, for example, during exam pressures and exam times, we need to ensure that we're not adding in lots more stress during exams, but we're easing right back on the training to ensure that the overall stress balance is appropriate. Physical capability, again, comes back to assessing an athlete to know where they're at, and that's the capability-demand equation once more. And then on the right-hand side, finally, we've got the sport, their playing position, their training history, and injury profile based on the assessment. So all of these things we have to consider when building a program for an individual. And in the next section, when we look at assessments, ultimately we're going to be looking at the injury profile, training history, and physical capability to understand where the athlete is at so we know what it is that we need to provide them in order to make them better and achieve their goals. So to finish this section, I wanted to give you an example from hockey and how I would therefore go about individualizing this training program. So here's a very typical sort of context. As a 16-year-old female hockey player, she's playing 4 times a week. She's got a training age of 1, so she's been training in a structured manner for a year. She has a previous history of ankle sprains, and let's say she's sprained her ankle once or twice before. She is completing her GCSEs currently. She has poor ankle proprioception and calf capacity and low levels of relative strength. So given that kind of context of a player coming to work with me or coming to work with a different coach, or if you are a 16-year-old hockey player or of a similar sort of age and context, then these are the kind of things we can do to mitigate these factors. So we'd probably be looking at, because it's around that exam period, something like 2 strength sessions per week of 30 minutes long. And that's because during exam period, you don't want to be doing lots more on top of what you're already is a busy schedule. If you're doing 4 hockey sessions plus you're doing exams, we just want to have short, sharp sessions that are age appropriate and are going to help to mitigate injury risk and keep you able to play in the long term. Basic bodyweight exercises to develop movement competence because of the kind of stage of development of the athlete. The primary outcome in this instance is probably going to be improving calf capacity and single leg balance, because, as I've already kind of briefly spoken about, the robustness tier in a hierarchical model suggests, or at least in my philosophy, suggests that mitigating the downside risk of injury first is more important than trying to push someone's performance up, and keeping players on the pitch and available is the best way to help them to develop in the long run, because the technical aspect of hockey is significantly more important in terms of accumulating hours than putting in more work physically if they're already technically, kicking on and talented in that kind of context. Reduced intensity based on increased exam stress, broadly speaking, because, as we've already said, if stress goes up in one sense, stress has to come back from somewhere else. Ankle loading in both sessions, we're getting frequent loading around the ankle to kind of protect it, and then a focus on multi-joint strength overall. So, again, just a quick reference there from Zatsiorsky and Kraemer, which I'd recommend if you're interested in kind of training principles, training science, and strength training overall. But to summarize this section, ultimately individuals need training that is matched to their requirements, because the more closely matched training is to an individual, the more appropriate it's going to be for them, and the better the results you're going to get, because it's going to be more aligned with their goals, more aligned with what's appropriate for them. And we have to consider many factors to ensure that training is appropriate for their stage of development.